You just witnessed a level of audacious corruption that defies all logic. The HOA president, Karen Donovan, didn't just try to fine me. She tried to execute a legal seizure of my fully restored, priceless classic car. Her justification? She invented a rule declaring my 1968 Rolls-Royce was an unapproved permanent structure. She genuinely believed she could just take it. Before we move forward, comment down from where you're watching right now. Little did she know, she hadn't just picked a fight with a hobbyist. She had just served a fraudulent warrant on a man who had spent 25 years as a judge advocate general in the military. She thought she was a tyrant. I was about to show her what a real predator looks like. But let me rewind to the moment the war began. It was a Tuesday morning. The air was crisp, and for the first time in 18 months, my garage didn't smell like primer and cutting oil. It smelled like carnauba wax and cured leather. I had just stepped back to look at the final result. A 1968 Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow, gleaming in Mason's black over shell gray. Every piece of chrome, from the spirit of ecstasy to the wheel hubs, had been polished to a mirror shine. It wasn't just a car. It was a resurrection, a tribute to my father, who had bought it new after his last tour. For a year and a half, I had poured every spare hour into bringing it back. I had rebuilt the V8 engine, restitched the Connolly leather, and refurbished the walnut burl dash until it glowed. It was more than a machine. It was a piece of my family's soul. I was wiping one last fingerprint off the grill when a shadow fell across the driveway. I didn't even have to look up. The shadow was accompanied by an aura of stale perfume and suffocating entitlement. It was Karen Donovan. She wasn't a Karen in the comical sense. She was a woman in her late 50s, a petty tyrant who ruled our community with an iron fist and a portfolio of imaginary violations. She didn't walk. She marched, a clipboard her permanent accessory, her face fixed in a mask of perpetual disapproval. She had fined an elderly neighbor, Mrs. Finch, into bankruptcy over the unapproved shade of her mailbox. She was a predator who fed on the fear of decent people. I felt the familiar, cold calm settle over me, the kind I used to get right before a court-martial. "Mr. Thorne," she announced. Her voice was sharp, a sound that could cut glass. "Good morning, Karen," I replied, my voice perfectly level. I didn't turn around. I just continued polishing the chrome. "You're in violation." That was her opening. Always. "Am I?" I asked, still focused on the car. "This project," she said, gesturing to the Rolls-Royce as if it were a pile of garbage, "has been an ongoing infraction for 18 months, but I was willing to be lenient, assuming you would be removing it from the premises." I finally stood up straight and turned to face her. I held the polishing rag in my hand. "Removing it? I just finished it. I plan on driving it." Karen Donovan actually smiled. It was a thin, reptilian expression that didn't touch her eyes. "I'm afraid that won't be possible. You seem to misunderstand the situation." She lifted her clipboard and unclipped a sheaf of papers. She held them out to me. "This is a notice of community lien," she said, her voice dripping with smug triumph. "And this is a cease and desist, ordering you to surrender the keys." I took the documents. I'm a man who lives by documents. I read them. The words were a masterpiece of fraudulent legal speak. It cited Bylaw 14.7, unapproved architectural and permanent structures. It stated that my construction of the vehicle in an open garage constituted an unapproved architectural addition, and that the finished structure, the car, was now in default. As such, it was designated a community asset, forfeit to the HOA, effective immediately. She hadn't come to fine me. She had come to take my car. She wanted it. The greed was rolling off her in waves. She probably pictured herself being chauffeured in it to the next board meeting. I read the entire document. I checked the citations. I noted the lack of a notary stamp. Then I looked up at her. She was waiting for me to yell, to panic, to plead. It's what she fed on. Instead, I just folded the papers neatly in half and held them. "You've made a procedural error," I said. My voice was quiet, almost conversational. Her smile faltered. This wasn't the reaction she had prepared for. "What? What did you say?" "This is a legal and binding notice, Mr. Thorne. My interpretation of the bylaws is final." "No," I said, taking a single step toward her. She instinctively took a step back. "Your interpretation is fraudulent. The document isn't notarized. The bylaw you've cited has been intentionally misrepresented, and the action you are attempting to take doesn't constitute a lien. It constitutes grand theft auto." Her face went from smug to blotchy red. "How dare you? I am the president of this board. This car is ours." "This car," I said, my voice dropping into a register I hadn't used in years, "is the registered, titled, and insured property of my family's estate. You are a private citizen attempting to seize an asset you have no legal claim to. You are on my property, presenting me with a fraudulent document in an attempt to commit a felony." I held up the papers. "And now I have the evidence. This conversation is over." I turned my back on her and went back to polishing the grill. I could hear her sputtering behind me. "You will be hearing from our lawyers. I will have you arrested," she shrieked. "No, you won't," I said without looking back. "But you will be hearing from me." She stormed off, her little empire rattling. She thought she was executing a simple asset seizure. She believed her self-appointed status gave her that power. She had no idea she had just declared war on a retired lieutenant colonel from the JAG Corps. She hadn't just picked a fight. She had just handed a prosecuting attorney all the evidence he needed to build a case, not just for the theft of my car, but for the complete and total annihilation of her entire corrupt enterprise. This wasn't going to be a fight. It was going to be a dissection, and I was about to begin. Karen Donovan's fatal error wasn't the fraudulent document. It wasn't even the attempted seizure of a $500,000 asset in broad daylight. Her fatal, unrecoverable error was one of simple target assessment. She looked at me and saw a quiet, graying man in a garage. She saw another soft civilian, another victim like Mrs. Finch, who would crumble when faced with the power of the HOA bylaws. She saw a hobbyist with an expensive toy. What she failed to see, what she couldn't possibly comprehend, was the predator that had been sitting quietly in her neighborhood for 3 years. She hadn't just prodded a sleeping lion. She had served a fraudulent seizure notice to the zookeeper. My name is Marcus Thorne, and for 25 years, I was a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army's Judge Advocate General's Corps. The JAG Corps isn't just about courtroom drama. It is the literal, structural spine of the entire United States military. It is the system of order, procurement, justice, and regulations that keeps the largest, most complex organization on Earth from collapsing into chaos. While other soldiers carried rifles, I carried the Uniform Code of Military Justice and the Federal Acquisition Regulations. My entire life, my entire career, was the meticulous application of complex rules and the absolute, unforgiving destruction of those who dared to bend them for their own gain. But even within the JAG Corps, I had a precise specialty. I wasn't the man who argued traffic tickets on the base or handled simple divorces. I was the man they sent in when a multi-billion-dollar defense contractor was caught submitting false invoices. I was the expert in federal procurement law, asset forfeiture, and criminal syndicates operating within the military-industrial complex. I was the architect of the very protocols used to seize the assets of corrupt officials and international arms dealers. I had personally written the seizure warrants that liquidated entire criminal enterprises, turning their yachts, their offshore bank accounts, and their private jets into government property. My entire job was to find the one tiny, fraudulent line in a 10,000-page contract and pull on it until the entire organization unraveled and collapsed. Karen Donovan had just handed me a fraudulent one-page document citing a bylaw she had invented. It was the strategic equivalent of arming herself with a pea shooter to go to war with a battleship, and she had chosen to seize the one thing on this earth that I was not, under any circumstances, willing to let go. That Rolls-Royce wasn't just a car, it wasn't a toy, it wasn't a midlife crisis purchase, it was the last physical piece of my father. He was a veteran of a different, harder war, a man of few words and absolute, unbending integrity. He bought that car new in 1968, the same year he returned from his final tour of duty. It was the one beautiful, extravagant, and perfect thing he ever allowed himself. As a kid, I remember he'd sit in it in the garage for hours, not even driving it, just listening to the radio. He said the smell of the Connolly leather and the tomb-like silence of the engine was the only thing that ever felt truly peaceful. When he passed, he left me exactly two things in his will: his worn service dog tags and the keys to the Rolls. The car, by then, was a ghost. It hadn't run in 2 decades. The engine was a seized block of rust. The leather was as dry and cracked as old parchment. The beautiful walnut burl dash was faded and peeling. The 18-month restoration wasn't a hobby. It was an act of duty. It was a promise I had made to him at his funeral. For a year and a half, I had hunted down original crew-manufactured parts from England. I had spent 6 grueling months rebuilding that complex V8 engine by hand, bolt by bolt, referencing the original 1,000-page technical manuals. I had taught myself how to steam bend wood and re-stitch Connolly leather just to restore the cabin to its former glory. Every hour I spent in that garage, covered in grease and sawdust, was an hour spent with my father. Karen Donovan hadn't just tried to steal a car. She had, in her infinite, arrogant ignorance, spit on a grave. She had tried to seize a memorial, and for that there would be no negotiation. There would be no settlement. There would only be annihilation. In the 3 years I'd lived in this neighborhood, I was a ghost. I was Colonel Thorne, the quiet man who kept his lawn immaculate, paid his dues on time, and gave a polite, detached nod to the people who passed by. I never attended the HOA meetings. I never got involved in the petty neighborhood politics and drama. I just wanted to be left alone to finish my work. Mrs. Finch, the same elderly woman Karen had terrorized over a mailbox, would often stop by on her walks. She'd ask about the car, her eyes lighting up as she saw the dead machine slowly come back to life. "Your father would be so proud, Colonel," she'd say. "He was a good man." The community knew me as a man of order, a man of peace, a man who followed the rules. Karen Donovan had mistaken my quiet for weakness. She had mistaken my solitude for fear. She had built her entire corrupt kingdom on the assumption that everyone she faced was disorganized, emotional, and ignorant of the law. She had just picked a fight with a man who was pathologically organized, clinically dispassionate, and had written the very laws of seizure and forfeiture she was now so clumsily breaking. She had kicked open the door to a JAG courtroom, and I was the judge, the jury, and the prosecuting attorney, all rolled into one. I went inside my house, leaving her fuming on the sidewalk. I opened the file drawer on my desk, the one I had used for my most complex federal cases. I took out a new manila folder and, in sharp black block letters, I wrote her name on the tab. The investigation had begun. My first step was not to file a countersuit. That would be premature. A predator doesn't fire a warning shot. My first step was reconnaissance. In the military, we call it developing the target package. Karen Donovan had shown me her primary weapon, the fraudulent bylaw. Now I needed to map her entire infrastructure, her supply lines, her assets, her co-conspirators. A tyrant like her is never truly alone. She requires a network, an ecosystem of fear and patronage to survive. I wasn't just investigating the attempted theft of my car. I was launching a full-spectrum counterintelligence operation against her entire regime. I didn't start with Google. I started with the State Division of Corporations. I pulled the original articles of incorporation for the Willowcrest Homeowners Association, along with every annual report and amendment filed since its inception. I was looking for one thing: the names. The board, on paper, consisted of 5 members, but the filings showed a disturbing pattern. 2 of the positions had been vacant for 3 years. The other 2 members, besides Karen Donovan, were a puppet treasurer named Arthur Pinter, a man I'd seen mumble his way through a public notice at the mailbox kiosk, and a community standards chair. But the real discovery, the one that cracked the entire conspiracy open, was in the vendor contracts. HOA financials are not public, not yet. But state law requires any corporation, even a non-profit HOA, to disclose major conflicts of interest. There were none listed. A clean record, which, in my experience, is the reddest flag of all. It meant the corruption was hidden in plain sight. I cross-referenced the HOA's approved vendor list, the one she mailed out every spring, with state business records. Donovan Landscaping and Towing. The name was almost comical in its arrogance. I ran the corporate registration. The registered agent and sole officer was one Patrick Donovan. The business address wasn't a commercial lot. It was a residential home just outside the county line. A quick check of property records confirmed my hypothesis. Patrick was her brother. This wasn't just petty nepotism. This was a system. Karen Donovan wasn't just a power-tripping president. She was the operational head of a small, parasitic, and fundamentally corrupt enterprise. She was using her elected position as a weapon to generate revenue for her family's business. She didn't just enforce the rules. She invented rules specifically to create violations that only her brother's company could fix. But I needed more than a paper trail. I needed to understand the human cost of her operation. I needed to speak to the victims. My first and only stop was Mrs. Finch. I walked across the street, not as a lawyer or a soldier, but as a neighbor. I found her in her garden, nervously pruning a rose bush. She was a widow in her late 70s, a kind woman who had lived in this house for 40 years, long before the HOA even existed. She flinched when she saw me approaching, her eyes darting toward Karen Donovan's house across the street. "Colonel Thorne," she whispered, her hands shaking. It's not a good time. She's watching." I stood in a way that blocked the line of sight from Karen's window. "I'm not here to chat, Mrs. Finch. I'm here as a fellow resident. I need to ask you about your mailbox." Her face went pale. "Oh, dear, that was terrible." She told me the story. It began with a single pale yellow notice slipped into her door. Aesthetic violation, non-conforming mailbox paint, shade 14B. A $100 fine. Mrs. Finch, terrified of breaking the rules, immediately went to the hardware store. They didn't have shade 14B. When she painted it a different HOA-approved beige, she received a second notice. Violation 14C, unapproved application of approved shade. The fine was now $500, plus daily late fees. She was in tears when she went to the board meeting to plead her case. Karen Donovan had been sympathetic. She had publicly reprimanded Mrs. Finch for her continued non-compliance, but had offered a helpful solution. The board, she claimed, had an approved vendor who could handle these sensitive aesthetic issues. A man from Donovan Landscaping arrived the next day. He repainted the mailbox in under an hour. The cost? $2,000. When Mrs. Finch said she couldn't possibly pay that, the man just smiled and said, "Ma'am, the bill goes to the HOA. They'll just add it to your dues." A month later, she received a certified letter from the HOA's attorney. She was in default for $2,500 in fines and remediation costs. They had placed a lien on her home. She had to drain her small savings account to pay it off, all for a can of paint. I felt that cold, familiar calm settle in. This was her system. This was the closed loop of extortion. She invents a violation. She compounds the fine. She intimidates the victim. She provides her brother as the solution. He triples the invoice. The HOA, directed by her, pays the fraudulent bill. And if the homeowner resists, she uses the HOA's own legal counsel, paid for by our dues, to bury them, ruin their credit, and threaten their homes. It was brilliant, it was vicious, and it was highly, wonderfully illegal. She had run this racket for years, targeting the elderly, the timid, the people who wouldn't fight back. She had successfully placed liens on real estate, the most secure asset a person can own. And now, flush with that arrogance, she had decided to escalate. She believed her power was absolute. She believed she could just point at something and claim it. She had just tried to use a system designed for extorting old women to seize a $500,000 classic car from a JAG officer. She had just given me a gift, the testimony of her first victim. And I was about to find all the others. Having a witness like Mrs. Finch was critical, but a victim's testimony is emotional. A jury, or in this case a judge, needs something cold. They need irrefutable empirical proof. My investigation moved from the human element to the paper trail, and for that I needed to go inside the black box, the HOA's finances. Karen Donovan would never surrender them voluntarily, so I didn't ask. I went to my desk and drafted a formal demand for inspection of books and records, citing the specific state statute that governs non-profit corporations. It wasn't a request. It was a legal command, delivered to the HOA's official email address and sent via registered mail to Arthur Pinter, the puppet treasurer. The law gave him 10 business days to comply, or he would be held personally liable for penalties. The panic I'd induced in Karen must have transferred to him, because I had a link to a disorganized, chaotic Dropbox folder in less than 48 hours. It was exactly what I was hoping for. They hadn't curated the files. They hadn't cleaned them up. They had just dumped everything, assuming I wouldn't have the patience or the expertise to sift through the digital garbage. For a man who had spent his career finding needles in haystacks of defense contracts, this was an afternoon's work. I downloaded every file, every bank statement, every general ledger, every invoice, every scanned check, and every meeting minute for the last 5 years. While that was downloading, I took a drive. I didn't go to the HOA office. I went to the County Recorder of Deeds. The official, legally binding Book of Covenants for Willowcrest was not the cheap 3-ring binder Karen Donovan waved around at meetings. It was a 200-page document, bound and stamped by the county with a recorded file number. I paid the clerk for a certified copy. I brought it back to my office and set it down next to my laptop. The hunt was on. The first thread I pulled was Bylaw 14.7, Unapproved Architectural and Permanent Structures. I went to the architectural section of the official county-filed covenants. I read every line. It was exactly as I'd suspected. The original, legally binding Bylaw 14.7 pertained to sheds, gazebos, and in-ground swimming pools. It said nothing about vehicles. It said nothing about projects. It said nothing about forfeiture. I then opened the Community Rules PDF that Arthur Pinter had just sent me, the one they distributed to residents. And there it was. Section 14.7, but with a new added subparagraph. 14.7 Any ongoing restoration, construction, or vehicle rebuild visible from a community-adjacent property shall be designated an unapproved permanent structure and shall be subject to immediate lien and seizure by the board. The page had a different font. The margins were misaligned. It was a forgery, a clumsy, arrogant, and utterly fraudulent insertion. She had taken a real bylaw and stapled her own fantasy rule onto it, believing no one would ever check the original source. This was the smoking gun. This was mail fraud, wire fraud, and a clear violation of the state's corporate governance laws. This one document, by itself, invalidated her entire claim against me. But I wasn't just building a defense. I was building a guillotine. I turned my attention to the financials. The bank statements told a story of pure, unadulterated embezzlement. It was exactly the loop Mrs. Finch had described, but on a massive scale. I saw the patterns immediately. First, a fine. A few $100s here, 1,000 there, levied against a homeowner. Then, a remediation payment, usually a few weeks later. These payments, ranging from $2,000 to as high as $10,000, were all made out to one vendor: Donovan Landscaping and Towing. Over 5 years, Karen Donovan had funneled over $200,000 of our community dues directly to her brother. This was open and shut nepotism, a massive breach of her fiduciary duty. But I knew there had to be more. Patrick Donovan couldn't be the only one profiting. I cross-referenced the payment dates from the HOA to Patrick's company with the bank statements from his business, which, in his stupidity, Arthur Pinter had also included in the file dump. And there it was. The beast. 3 days after every large payment from the HOA landed in Patrick's account, a new payment went out. It wasn't to a hardware supplier, it wasn't for payroll, it was a consulting fee, and it went to a shell company I had never heard of, KGD Enterprises, LLC. I ran the corporate registration. KGD Enterprises had been formed 4 years ago. Its business purpose was listed as Professional Management Consulting. Its sole registered agent and officer? Karen G. Donovan. This wasn't just nepotism. This wasn't just corruption. This was a criminal conspiracy. This was a classic, indictable kickback scheme. She was using our money to pay her brother, who was then laundering that money and kicking back a percentage to her through a shell corporation. This was the very definition of a racketeer-influenced and corrupt organization, the textbook definition of RICO. She wasn't just a bully, she was a mob boss, and I had just found her ledger. I saved every file to a military-grade encrypted hard drive. I created a digital murder board, linking every fraudulent invoice to every kickback, every fake bylaw to every victim. The case was built. All the evidence was secure. I knew my legal victory was now an inevitability. But I also knew a cornered animal is the most dangerous. She had no idea I had done any of this. She was still fuming from our encounter, and her notice of lien had a 10-day expiration date. She was about to escalate, and I had to be ready. I went online and purchased 3 broadcast-quality, high-definition night vision cameras, one for the driveway, one for the street, and one monitoring the side of my house. The trap was set. Now, I just had to wait for the animal to walk into it. I didn't have to wait long. The notice of community line expired at 9 a.m. on a Friday. The 10-day window had slammed shut. I had spent the intervening week in my study, not in a panic, but in a state of cold, clinical focus. I was compiling the mountain of evidence I had unearthed into a devastating, cross-referenced and prosecutable file. I had intentionally ignored every one of her increasingly hysterical and threatening emails. I hadn't responded, I hadn't argued, I hadn't even acknowledged her. I knew this deliberate silence would be more infuriating to her than any argument. Her power, I had assessed, was built entirely on the fear she could generate. A target that shows no fear is a target she cannot process. She had been publicly defied by the quiet colonel, and now her pride and her narcissistic arrogance demanded a public show of force. My new cameras were active, their green lights glowing faintly in the morning shadows, recording everything in crystal clear 4K. I was in my kitchen, brewing a fresh pot of coffee, when the low, guttural rumble of a heavy-duty diesel engine vibrated the windows. Showtime. I looked through the blinds of my study. A massive, deep blue flatbed tow truck with Donovan Towing and Landscaping emblazoned on the door in gaudy, peeling yellow letters was aggressively backing into my driveway. The exhaust fumes billowed, temporarily obscuring the no trespassing sign I had posted. The driver was a large, sloppy man in a stained shirt, precisely as I'd pictured him from the corporate filings. Patrick Donovan, her brother. And standing on the sidewalk, clipboard in hand like a tin pot general directing an invasion, was Karen Donovan herself. She was pointing at my garage, her face a mask of smug, vindictive triumph. She truly believed this was her moment of victory. She thought she was here to collect her prize. She was, in real time, escalating her conspiracy from paper fraud to a physical, indictable crime. I didn't run out. I didn't yell. I didn't grab my keys to block the driveway. My weapon was superior. I poured my coffee into a mug, picked up a single thick manila file from my desk, and walked through my house. I hit the button for the garage door, and it rolled up with a quiet, mechanical hum, revealing the Rolls-Royce gleaming under the lights. It was a silent testament to what this was all about. I walked calmly down the driveway and stopped about 10 feet from the truck, planting myself directly between the flatbed's winch and the front bumper of my car. Patrick Donovan, seeing me, lumbered out of the cab. He was a physically intimidating man, but he had the dull, vacant eyes of a man who just followed orders. "Morning, Patrick," I said. My voice was level, calm, almost conversational. "He can't talk to you!" Karen Donovan shrieked from the sidewalk. She was practically vibrating with adrenaline. "Mr. Thorne, you were given a legal and binding notice to surrender the community asset. You have failed to comply with a lawful order from the board. We are here to repossess the structure." "Repossess?" I asked, my voice laced with a cold, precise amusement. "You can't repossess something you never owned, Karen. You are currently trespassing on my property. And you, Patrick," I said, shifting my gaze to her brother, "are currently an accessory to attempted grand theft auto. I'd think very carefully about your next move if I were you." Patrick hesitated, his hand on the massive steel winch hook. He was just a tow truck driver. Grand theft auto was a charge he understood. It was a felony. But Karen surged forward, her face turning a blotchy, furious red. This was not going according to her script. "I knew you'd be difficult. I knew you'd be hostile. You are obstructing official HOA business." She fumbled for her phone. "I am calling the police to have you removed." This was it. The critical, fatal miscalculation I had been counting on. The moment she would, in her supreme arrogance, invite the executioner to her own hanging. "Please do," I said. "I insist. Get them here immediately." She shrieked into the phone, a masterful performance of a victim under siege. She claimed a hostile homeowner was threatening her and her employee, and was illegally blocking the seizure of official HOA property. 2 police cruisers arrived in under 5 minutes. A senior officer and his younger partner got out, their expressions tired. They had clearly responded to HOA disputes before. The officer looked at the massive tow truck, at the priceless classic car in the garage, and then at me, a man in a polo shirt calmly holding a coffee mug and a single file. What's the problem here, folks? Officer, thank God, Karen gushed, launching into her prepared speech. This is Karen Donovan. I am the president of the Willowcrest HOA. This man, she pointed at me as if I were a cockroach, is in violation of bylaw 14.7. The HOA has placed a legal lien on that unapproved structure in his garage. Here is the official notice. He has refused to comply, and he is now obstructing us from taking possession. I want him arrested for theft and trespassing. She handed her fraudulent, forged document to the officer with a triumphant flourish. The officer read her document. He looked confused. He looked at the car, then back at the paper. Ma'am, this says the car is a structure? He turned to me. Sir, I'm going to need you to step aside? I finished for him. I'm afraid I can't do that, officer, but I can, and I will, clarify the entire situation for you. I opened my file. I did not hand him the whole thing. I handed him 4 specific paper-clipped items. What Ms. Donovan gave you is a fraudulent document, and I'll stake my career on that. This, I said, handing him the certified, county-stamped copy of the Willow Crest Covenants, is the actual legally binding covenant pulled from the County Recorder of Deeds office 2 days ago. I've tabbed the relevant page. As you can see, bylaw 14.7 pertains to sheds and gazebos. Her version is a forgery. The officer's eyes scanned the real bylaw, then snapped back to the fake one Karen had given him. His entire demeanor changed. The casual annoyance was gone, replaced by a cold, professional focus. This, I continued, handing him my state-issued vehicle title, is the clear and unencumbered title for the 1968 Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow, registered in my name. And this, I said, handing him my retired military credentials, my JAG Corps ID, is who I am. The officer looked at the JAG Corps ID. He looked at the real title. He looked at the forged bylaw. He looked at Karen Donovan. In that 5-second span, he connected the dots. He wasn't dealing with a hostile homeowner. He was dealing with a federal legal expert and the victim of a transparent, provable crime. Ma'am, the officer said to Karen, his voice now flat and devoid of all respect. The document you have given me appears to be fraudulent. The bylaw you're citing does not match the official county record. This is a clear civil matter, and attempting to tow a vehicle with a clear title based on a document like this, well, that's not an HOA action. That's attempted theft. You need to leave now. Karen started to sputter. Her face had gone from red to a sickly, pale white. You can't, my lawyer. I ignored her. I had one more piece of business. I turned my full attention to her brother, who looked like he wanted to evaporate. I walked right up to him, past the officer, and handed him a single-page document from my file. This is a notice of personal liability, I said, my voice low and sharp, for him and him alone. I know who you are, Patrick. I know about your company. I know about the kickbacks. If your hook, your chain, or even a speck of dust from your truck touches my car, I will not sue the HOA. I will sue you. I will sue your LLC. I will bankrupt your insurance carrier. I will seize your truck, your house, and every dollar you have ever earned from this corrupt little scam. Am I absolutely crystal clear? Patrick Donovan's face went white. He looked at his sister, then at the police officer who was now watching him intently, then at the legal notice in his shaking hand. He dropped the heavy steel winch hook on the pavement with a loud, echoing clang. I'm not touching it, he said, his voice a low growl. This ain't worth it. What? Karen shrieked. Patrick, you get that car. You get it now. Shut up, Karen, he roared back at her. I'm not going to jail for you. You're crazy. He scrambled back into his cab, fired up the engine with a roar, and pulled his massive truck out of my driveway, leaving a streak of black diesel smoke, and the smell of his fear behind. Karen Donovan stood there, alone on the sidewalk. shaking with a primal fury I had only seen in courtrooms when a guilty verdict is read. She had been publicly humiliated. Her hired muscle had abandoned her. Her own weapon, the police, had been turned against her, and they were now looking at her as the criminal. "You're done here, Karen," the officer said, his patience gone. "Go home, or we'll have a different conversation." She gave me a look of pure, undiluted hatred, a look that promised this was far from over, that she would burn the world down before she accepted defeat. As I watched her storm off, I knew she was right. The public humiliation was just the appetizer. The main course was the complete legal and financial destruction of her entire life, and I was about to serve it. I watched Karen Donovan disappear into her house, but I didn't feel rage or satisfaction. I felt the cold, familiar calm of a prosecutor who has just secured all the damning evidence he needs. Her look of pure hatred wasn't a threat. It was a promise that she would be irrational, emotional, and therefore predictable. She thought the war was still being fought over a single car and a bogus fine. She was wrong. The war had already moved out of my driveway and into the federal jurisdiction. My goal was no longer to merely defend my Rolls-Royce. My goal was the total, irreversible legal and financial annihilation of the Donovan criminal syndicate, and for that, I had to bring the full weight of the state and federal government down on her head. I wasn't going to hire a local civil attorney. I was going to become the executioner. My counteroffensive was surgical and absolute. It began not with a single lawsuit, but with a coordinated three-pronged legal and regulatory assault designed to maximize her personal exposure and guarantee her criminal prosecution. First, the civil front. I filed a RICO, Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, lawsuit against Karen Donovan, her brother Patrick Donovan, and the puppet treasurer Arthur Pinter. I didn't file this in state court. I filed it in federal district court. Why RICO? Because the law is designed to prosecute individuals who engage in a pattern of racketeering activity. My evidence: the fraudulent bylaw insertion, mail fraud, the $200,000 in kickbacks, wire fraud, the systematic extortion of homeowners like Mrs. Finch, and the attempted grand theft auto of my vehicle, clearly established a continuous criminal enterprise. I sued them, individually and collectively, for $1.5 million in damages, citing punitive damages for their deliberate malice and financial injury to the community. The second prong was the regulatory and corporate death blow. I had enough evidence to kill the HOA as a legal entity. I compiled the certified deed of covenants, the forged bylaw 14.7, and all the financial documentation showing the massive, unauthorized expenditures. I sent this entire, meticulously organized package to the State Attorney General's office. The accompanying letter wasn't from Marcus Thorne, homeowner. It was from Marcus Thorne, retired JAG officer, citing specific state statutes regarding corporate governance fraud and nonprofit fiduciary breaches. I requested an immediate investigation and the imposition of a statutory receivership to freeze the HOA's assets and suspend the board. The AG's office moves slowly, but when they move, they carry a wrecking ball. Karen Donovan's life savings, wrapped up in her scheme, were about to become evidence. The final and most devastating prong was the criminal exposure. I stripped the kickback scheme bare. I created a simple, easily digestible chart showing the $200,000 flow of money. HOA dues: Fyr Right Arrow Donovan Towing, Patrick; Fyr Right Arrow KGD Enterprises, Karen's Shell LLC. This wasn't just corporate fraud. It was textbook tax evasion and money laundering. The IRS has no patience for this kind of organized deceit. I packaged the evidence and sent it via secure delivery to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, CID, I highlighted the fact that Karen Donovan was using her elected position to commit tax fraud, a detail that always seems to expedite federal interest. The CID wasn't interested in my car. They were interested in the 5 years of undeclared income and the fraudulent expenses Patrick Donovan's shell company was claiming. The impact was immediate and overwhelming. The first sign of the beast moving was a certified letter arriving from the HOA's insurance carrier, a massive corporate giant. I had sent them a copy of my RICO filing. The letter stated that due to the clear and documented pattern of criminal, fraudulent, and self-serving acts by the board president and her associates, the HOA's director and officer, D&O liability policy, was immediately and permanently revoked. This was the real hammer. Karen Donovan was now fighting a federal RICO lawsuit with $1.5 million in personal exposure, and she had no insurance coverage. She was standing completely naked on the legal battlefield. Her response was predictable and pathetic. She tried to schedule an emergency board meeting, presumably to levy a massive, illegal, special assessment against the homeowners to pay for her own defense. That was her last desperate power play. But I had already given Arthur Pinter, the terrified treasurer, an ultimatum. He could come clean now and cooperate, or I would list him as a co-conspirator in the RICO case, exposing him to decades of personal financial ruin. Arthur, seeing the AG's office circle and the massive RICO judgment looming, folded like a cheap suit. He signed a comprehensive affidavit detailing Karen's instructions on forging the bylaw and approving the fraudulent payments. The beast had turned on its master. The entire monstrous structure was collapsing under the weight of its own corruption. The stage was set for the final, public annihilation. The system had taken my filing and turned it into an unstoppable, self-executing weapon. Karen Donovan, completely cut off and panicking, did exactly what I predicted. She scheduled a final, desperate emergency HOA meeting. Her objective was clear: use the last scraps of her presidential authority to browbeat the terrified homeowners into approving a massive legal defense fund that would essentially fleece the community to save her from the federal RICO judgment. She intended to make the neighborhood pay for her crimes. This was her last stand. And I was about to turn that meeting into her public execution. The community center was packed that night. The air was thick with tension, not just curiosity, but cold, palpable anger. Everyone knew something catastrophic was happening. Karen was at the head table, flanked by a pale, sweating Arthur Pinter, the treasurer, and one other board member who looked ready to bolt. Karen was wearing a severe, dark suit, her face set in a look of granite defiance. She was trying to project unshakable authority, but her eyes, darting nervously around the room, betrayed the absolute terror she was feeling. She started the meeting by trying to take control, launching into a venomous, hyperbolic speech about hostile elements and irresponsible homeowners, trying to destroy the community with frivolous lawsuits. She then presented the prepared resolution, a $250,000 special assessment, effective immediately to combat the unfounded legal assault by Marcus Thorne. It was a masterpiece of vicious manipulation. Before she could even ask for a vote, I stood up. I didn't yell. I didn't ask a question. I simply walked to the front of the room, carrying a projector and a single locked briefcase. I placed the briefcase on the table, right in front of her. "Madam President," I said, my voice cutting through the room with the force of a command. "Before the community is asked to vote on a $250,000 tax, I believe they deserve a complete, transparent briefing on the actual legal situation they face." I plugged in the projector and aimed it at the wall. My opening slide was simple. RICO case 524 CV 980, Thorne vs. Donovan et al. Beneath it, a single line. Damages sought were $500,000. The gasp that went through the room was deafening. Karen screamed, "You are out of order! This meeting is adjourned. You will be removed. But I was ready. Arthur Pinter, the terrified treasurer, finally found his backbone. He pushed his chair back, stood up, and his voice, though shaking, was clear. No, I've already told the State Attorney General everything. She is lying. The HOA is insolvent. He pulled out his own affidavit and slammed it down on the table. The RICO suit is real. She forged the bylaw. She and her brother stole over $200,000 of our money through a shell company. The room erupted into absolute, visceral chaos. People were on their feet, screaming thief and fraud. The entire monstrous operation had just been confessed by her own co-conspirator. Karen was trying to grab Arthur, shouting denials, her composure completely shattered. I didn't let the emotion linger. I took the stage, projecting my evidence. The corporate flowchart, the forged bylaw 14.5, and the State Attorney General's notification of impending corporate dissolution. I showed them that every fine she had ever levied, every dollar she had ever demanded, was built on a foundation of fraud. At the height of the pandemonium, the final blow was struck. The door of the community center opened, and 2 uniformed IRS Criminal Investigation Division agents and Sergeant Miller walked in. They were not subtle. They walked straight through the crowd, ignoring Karen's hysterical shouting. They stopped at the table, right next to my briefcase. Karen Donovan, the lead CID agent stated, his voice a drone of federal authority. You are under arrest on warrants for wire fraud, mail fraud, and engaging in a pattern of racketeering activity. She was cuffed right there, in front of the entire furious community she had terrorized for years. They led her out of the room, past the stunned, silent homeowners. Her face was a mask of pure, shattered devastation, completely devoid of the arrogance she had worn for decades. The tyrant was deposed. The immediate aftermath was total victory. Karen Donovan's life was annihilated. The HOA was immediately placed into statutory receivership, and I was appointed by the court as the interim controller to oversee its dissolution and restructuring. She didn't just lose the car, she lost her house, which was tied up in the frozen assets of the HOA, and she faced years in federal prison for the tax and wire fraud. Her brother's towing company was seized and immediately liquidated. I had done it. I had used her own arrogance, her own fraudulent paper, to bring down the full, crushing weight of the federal government. I secured justice for Mrs. Finch and every other homeowner she had abused. A week later, the storm had passed. A large "For Sale" sign now stood awkwardly on Karen Donovan's pristine lawn. The neighborhood was quiet, liberated. I walked into my garage one final time, now completely free of the threat. The Rolls-Royce gleamed. I popped the trunk, removed the briefcase that held my RICO files, and tossed it into the deep shadows. It was done. I slid into the driver's seat, the V8 engine caught on the first turn of the key, settling into a deep, contented purr. The sound of ultimate, perfect revenge. My wife, Pam, slid in beside me, holding a cup of coffee. I backed the 1968 Silver Shadow out of the garage, drove slowly past Karen's empty house, and pointed the car onto the open road. The sun hit the polished chrome. The car felt right. It felt free. The cost of standing up to the bully had been high, but the price of freedom was worth every single minute of the fight.